Hello and welcome to the second video from the biblical timeline. Today we're going to do an overview of biblical chronology from the time of Christ all the way back to creation. So this is going to be a very high level video and discussion. There's already a video out there on Kings and Chronicles, and eventually I plan to post more to cover some of the other key questions in here, but this we're going to keep at a fairly high level. So, to begin, we're talking about biblical history, particularly the Old Testament. The most well-known work on this is by a guy named James Ussher, who published in 1650. And he famously put creation on a Sunday afternoon in October in 4004 BC, for which he has been mocked for attempting to get to that level of precision. But that's out there, and you'll often hear that date quoted by people as an example of, oh, this can't be right, but just want to put that out there. This was also an important topic for other important folks in the church back in that period of time. Sir Isaac Newton did a bunch of work that was published after his death. There are sort of lots of others that have worked on this problem. And there really is not a single solution. And we'll see a bit of why that is later on. In ancient times, there were also a lot of people who wrote on this topic. Most famously, probably, was Josephus, who had the benefit of the temple scrolls that were rescued when the Romans conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. He had access to those. And he wrote something called the Antiquities of the Jews, as well as some other works that dealt with Jewish history. Eusebius would be another one. He's most well known for his history of the early church up to his time, but he also did a chronicle of everything sort of the Old Testament history up to that to his time as well. And then there are lots of others, a lot of whom we don't have the original works anymore, but we have quotations in either Josephus or Eusebius or possibly in other historians as our basis. So the important thing about these guys is that all the ancient historians were really doing textual studies. So they're telling us, well, I've read this guy's work and he says this happened in this year. And that's how they're building up their history. There's no benefit of archaeology. They're not going and they're not reading the tomb walls in Egypt or the inscriptions in Assyria. It's all from the scrolls that they have access to. On the plus side, though, they had access to things that we don't have anymore. So most importantly, probably Manetho, who was an Egyptian historian. All we have is fragments of his work that are preserved in Josephus and Eusebius and a few others. So they definitely had sources that we don't have, and we're able to benefit from that. And we really can't go back and check their work, if you will, because we just don't have those things anymore. As we get into this, I'm going to walk us through most of what I'll call the 7 problems in Old Testament chronology, which are: when was creation? Right? When was the world created according to the Bible? When was the flood? When was Joseph in Egypt? If he was in Egypt, when was that? And can we correlate that to a particular pharaoh or a particular time in Egypt? When did the Exodus occur? How long were the children of Israel in Egypt after Joseph and Jacob? And then again, what pharaoh was ruling when they left? When did the judges rule? This is actually a fairly thorny problem even to this day. When did the Hebrew kings live? And finally, when was the 70-year captivity? I could probably add an 8, which is when were the 70 weeks or 69 weeks of Daniel? I'm not going to cover that today. That's sort of really more of a New Testament topic, and I'll probably cover that at some time in the future. So if we're going to get to this, what we need to do here is first establish when the kings lived. And the details of all the reigns of the kings are in Kings and Chronicles, but we've got to get to a solid date somewhere in that period that we can start working backwards from, because there's nothing in the Old Testament that tells us really, how far before the birth of Christ was any of the kings or really anyone else. So we need to get ourselves to a starting date. Once we have that, we can figure out the Kings and Chronicles. We're going to kind of fly over the judges, and when we get there, you'll see why. But then we go to when was the Exodus, and the key verse for that is 1 Kings 6:1. When was Joseph in Egypt? The key verse for that is Exodus 12:40. When was the flood? Well, we can work back from the patriarchs to the flood using Genesis 11. And then finally, we can work all the way back to creation using Genesis 5. So this is the path that we're going to go down, but you'll see that it's not exactly cut and dried. There's a lot of things going on here. For one, if you consult a number of different sources, pick a textbook, maybe look on Wikipedia or something else, you're going to see some variation. And in fact, in doing research for the timeline, I was amused to find, you'd find a master article like all the Egyptian pharaohs in Wikipedia, and then you go into the detail on a pharaoh, and it would give different dates in the master articles. So there's still a lot of dispute about some of this. In what we call the Orthodox or Old Chronology, generally those disputes aren't too big, say plus or minus 10 years, but they do exist, and some are bigger than that, some less. But you'll also see just minor variations, and I wanted to show everyone that just so people don't get concerned about little differences between what I'm going to show you and what you might find in another source. First here is the issue of the reckoning of years. So we use what's called a Julian year, which starts on January 1st and goes to December 31st. But that's not the year that was used in the ancient world. In fact, it's called Julian because it was created by Julius Caesar. So this is not a way of reckoning the year that we had until very, very late in the period that we're looking at. In Israel, there were actually 2 years used, a Nisan year, which started in the spring, and that was the sort of ceremonial year beginning. The Passover was the 15th of the month of Nisan, so in the spring. There was also a civil year, which was the Tishri year, and you'll see that for some things are reckoned in one system and others are reckoned in the other. But that a given year, here a Julian year, would actually could overlap, if we're dating things based on a Nisan or a Tishri year, could overlap into the year before or the year after. And you very often will see dates then written as shown here as 586/7. So it could be 586 BC, it could be 587 BC, depending on where in the year it exactly was. And most of the time people will drop the slash. So you'll see in my case, I'm just going to call it 586. It could have been 587. I'm not worried in the scheme of things about that plus or minus a year, and you shouldn't be either. Another element here, particularly as we get through the kings, but this applies equally when we talk about kings in other countries, is the question of how they reckoned the years of a monarch. Much of ancient history is based on, this event happened in the 5th year of King X. Well, how do we know what was the 5th year? How does the 5th year get reckoned? It was only much later with Greece, when you get to the first Olympiad in 776, and after that, a lot of things are reckoned in the Olympic cycle, and we can really, work with things like we do today from a specific date. Rome was reckoned from the founding of Rome in 753 BC, so again, we can use those dates in those 2 countries. But most of the rest of the world, and certainly everything before that, was done based on the years of a monarch. And it was all reckoning time over long periods was based on adding up those years. So that creates a little problem that I'll just want to bring to everybody's attention. Here are Israel and Judah with their different year reckonings. You'll see they're 6 months apart. So if we have, here's a couple of kings on the Judah side, one reigns for 8 years, and then the other one starts, and we just covered the first official year there. And this is what's called ascension year dating. What that means is that the year that they ascend to the throne is year 0. It's the ascension year, and then the first year of their reign is actually the following year. In contrast, on the Israel side, they use what's called non-ascension year dating, which means that the year that you ascend to the throne is year 1, and then the January, well, whatever, in this case, March of the following year becomes the beginning of year 2. And when you look at this and how a couple of kings might reign in the alternate kingdoms, you can quickly see how you've got 7 regnal years showing under Israel amounts to only 5 years in Judah. And that's how you can get some interesting differences. You also, again, have this problem potentially if you were comparing, say, between Assyria and Babylon, or either of those in Israel or Judah. So just something to note as to why you may have some small differences and why some things may not seem to add up if you're trying to do this by reading Kings and Chronicles. So let's get started on our little journey back through history. We start in the time of Christ, which I have here as 5 BC to 33 AD, and there are obviously options around that, and I won't get into that here. But he's clearly in a period where Rome was the major power in Palestine. Rome conquered Jerusalem in the first time in 63 BC. That was Pompey was the general. That's who the city of Pompeii is named after. He was part of the first triumvirate with Crassus and Julius Caesar. So that's sort of the historical context. You'll see as we go back here that I have not only shown kind of who's the major power in Palestine or earlier Canaan and what's going on there, but also trying to throw out some of the names that might be familiar to you and events that were taking place in parallel. So in the Roman period, we have the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt with Cleopatra. You'll see this. You'll see Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, and just before that, Spartacus. Going back to Palestine, prior to the Romans, it was the Maccabees, and the Maccabees took power after the Maccabean revolt in 165. You can find the stories of some of this in the books of Maccabees, which you won't find in a Protestant Bible, but if you have a Catholic Bible with an Apocrypha, you'll find those books and be able to read some of that. They took over from the Seleucids. So Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire 331 as the major battle that really ended things for the Persians. He obviously didn't live very long after that, and his empire broke apart into 4 pieces. The 2 big pieces were the Seleucids, who really covered the area of Mesopotamia into Syria and Palestine, and the Ptolemies, who had Egypt. And so the Seleucids ruled from about 312 BC through to that Maccabean revolt, which was really followed out of the desecration of the temple in 168 by Antiochus Epiphanes, Daniel's little horn, or the abomination of desolation. So that's why you see a reference from Daniel there. During that period, we had the Punic Wars with Rome, which is where Hannibal was involved, and you know the stories about him. Going back a little further, the Persian Empire was running things from Cyrus and his defeat of Babylon through to the conquest of Alexander, and we have a lot that happens in that period in Greek history. We have the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, the Peloponnesian War, a number of famous people, Herodotus, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who was actually Alexander the Great's tutor. Also, the Book of Esther falls in this period, really at the same time as the Greco-Persian War and the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. So that's really the historical context there. Prior to the Persians were the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar, really the Babylonian Empire, came to power with the fall of Nineveh in 612. That created a bit of a power vacuum and allowed a brief resurgence of the power of Egypt in Palestine, which you'll see there. And that was the cause of the interaction between Pharaoh Necho and Josiah, leading to Josiah's death and a number of other battles there. 605, the Battle of Carchemish, their power was broken by the Babylonians, and thus began the Babylonian Empire, initially placing Judah under tribute and then ultimately destroying Jerusalem in 586. The date of 586 is a solid date. I think if you pretty much consult any history book, you will see a date very close to that, if not that date. So we've basically gone back, and that will be the date of the end of the kingdom of Judah, which we will use to work backwards to find the beginning. Now, before we do that, I need to introduce a concept which is old and new chronologies. The old chronology is what you will find in pretty much any history book, or if you look things up on Wikipedia to try and find the dates of various pharaohs. You're going to get something relatively close to what I'm showing here on the top row, which is old. In the late 1990s, a movement started to identify a new chronology. And the leading figure in this is a guy named David Rohl. He's an Egyptologist. And you may have seen him if you've seen the Patterns of Evidence Exodus movie. He plays a prominent role in that. He's not the only guy in this movement by any means, but he's really, I think, sort of the figurehead at this time. And his PhD thesis work was on the Third Intermediate Period in Egypt and re-looking at the evidence for that. And he came up with a very different solution than what had been there before, which creates a much compacted Third Intermediate Period. And you'll see here on the top, that purple area is the traditional Third Intermediate Period going from the 20th to the 25th dynasties in Egypt. In the new chronology, we have a very compressed period covering the same dynasties. The The last point of agreement going backwards is the reign of Pharaoh Taharko, which ends in 664 with the sack of Thebes by Assurbanipal. So that also is a synchronism between Egyptian history and Assyrian history. So it's a point we can say, hey, these line up between these two kingdoms, and we have real confidence that this is the correct date, or at least that we've got the right people on the scene at the same time there. The other thing that happens in this is a change in the identification of Pharaoh Shishak. So as you may recall, after Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam comes to the throne, the kingdom splits, and Shishak comes in, and I think it's the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, and carries off all the treasures of Jerusalem and the temple. Historically, this has been identified as Shishak the First. That identification was made by Champollion in the 1820s when he had first discovered how to read hieroglyphics, and has lasted to this day. It's based on an inscription on a temple wall, I believe at Karnak in Egypt. But I think today people would look at that and say, actually, he made a mistake. The translation that he came up with for a certain set of hieroglyphs is wrong. It didn't say Judah, it names another city, and that casts doubt on that identification. The other candidate, and the one that Rawle identifies, is Ramses the Great. So he would say that Ramses the Great is actually Shishak, and you might say, well, that name doesn't sound anything like Shishak. However, Ramses had a nickname, which was Shishya, which sounds a lot more like Shishak. And so there's good reason to believe that that could be actually the correct identification. And if you are really interested in this, go read Rawle's book, Exodus, Myth or History, which explains a lot of this in much more detail. But for us, what I'm going to do, I'm going to present both timelines, but I want folks to understand that what they are and what the differences are, so that we can look at this from both sides. With this collapse in the timeline, you'll see that the date for the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period moves from 1185 BC to 865 BC. So that's a change of 320 years. And it happens to coincide with the fall of Troy. So in the traditional chronology, the fall of Troy is 1184 BC. In the new chronology, it's in 864 BC. So a year before this happens. Lots of reason to believe that war caused a general collapse around the ancient world, and that partly how these things all link together. The other point to make here is that the changes don't just affect Egypt. They affect some of the other kingdoms that obviously interacted with Egypt, because if you can say that Pharaoh X interacted with, King of Assyria B, then you can link those two together, and that helps to refine the dating for both. What we see is, though, for Assyria and Babylon, the change due to the new chronology only really takes place in the 10th century BC, so before 900 BC. For Tyre and Phoenicia, actually, they're good all the way back to almost 1000 BC, and there really is no change in the dating for Rome from its founding, or in Greece from the first Olympiad. There are some changes in Greek history after the first Olympiad that relate to things that aren't dated, or dated in generations and other things, but most of Greek history is solid from that first Olympiad. So this is the basic concept, and this will become important as we look at Joseph and the Exodus in a bit. So now we can work our way backwards a little further to the foundation of the temple. So from the previous slides, we know that the fall of Jerusalem was in 586 BC. We also know from the Assyrian records that the fall of Samaria and the kingdom of Israel was in 723 BC. And we can work back along both of those lines, and we get to the same date for the end of Solomon's reign, which is in 930. So Solomon reigned for 40 years. That puts the beginning of his reign in 970. And 1 Kings 6:1 tells us that the temple foundation was laid in the 4th year of his reign. And that's really our critical date, 966 BC. What we see here, the dates of all the kings are based on the work of a guy named Edwin Thiele, or Thiele. And he's really the definitive work on this subject, the majority opinion, if you will. There are some later modifications to his work, but I think if you stick with these dates, you'll be on very solid ground. Those modifications don't really shift Solomon, They're dealing with some of the things that you see here where there's overlaps and co-regencies and Hezekiah and other things. So we're on pretty solid ground here. Some key things in this period of time. 701 is Sennacherib besieging Jerusalem. That's also recorded by Herodotus. You'll see the blue triangles are events that we can find not only in historical records, but also in the Bible. The black triangles are things that are only on the historical side, but some of those are critical to nailing down these dates. And in particular, in 853, Ahab fought against Shalmaneser III at the Battle of Karkar. In 841, 12 years later, Jehu was paying tribute to Shalmaneser III, to the same king. And we find those from the Assyrian records. The interesting thing is in Scripture, there's only 12 years between those two kings. And what that means is that Ahab must have fought against Shalmaneser in the very last year of his reign, and Jehu must have paid tribute in the very first year of his reign. And that allows us to lock in basically the dates for most of the kingdom of Israel, is those two synchronisms with Assyria. Recall that the Assyrian timeline back through this period does not change in the Old and New chronology, so the chronology for Israel also doesn't change. It's solid. We do see some changes, which you noted before. You see Shishak and Ramsey and how they have moved around. Also, in the New chronology, you can then date Agamemnon from the Iliad and the fall of Troy, and those become much more rooted in history than say, the myth that they are really as considered in the Orthodox chronology. So you have a lot going on here, but this is really as far back as we go with Greek and sort of therefore Western history and the things that we're familiar with, and things start to get a lot more murky once we get back before 1000 BC. As we'll see, there's more debate about the timelines and who's when. So here I need to make an important point before we make the jump to the Exodus about Ramesses II. A lot of people that I know believe that Ramesses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and including my father and particularly that older generation. That's kind of what they were taught growing up, and there's a good reason for that. If you look at Exodus 1:11, it says that when they enslaved the Israelites, they had them build treasure cities or supply cities, named in particular a city called Ramesses. And the city of Ramses only existed for a short period of time and was built by Ramses the Great. So it's pretty logical to say, well, if they built Ramesses, then must be Ramses the Great, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? But there's a big problem with that logic. There is another verse that dates the Exodus, and it puts it well before the reign of Ramesses. And if we saw in the New chronology, Ramesses is contemporary with Solomon, so clearly it didn't happen in his reign. It couldn't in that chronology, and even in the Old chronology, he's really too late for the dates of the Exodus, and we'll see that in a minute. Also, all the archaeological and sort of other textual evidence would say that Ramses II is not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. There is just absolutely no evidence to place the Exodus in that period of time. Now, how do you deal with the scripture? Well, the children of Israel did build a city at the site that later became known as Ramses. But they did that in an earlier time when that city had a different name, which is Avaris. So what happened? Well, we believe that the name Ramses was a later addition or update that happened perhaps during the time of Solomon when that city was being constructed, or perhaps a little bit later, but that the Hebrew scribes updated the reference because the old name was no longer in use, and they wanted it to still be clear as to where this had happened. That name Ramses is actually also used for where Jacob and the children of Israel settle in Goshen at a time clearly hundreds of years before the city even existed. So there's good reason to believe it was really an update. And you think about that, to give a good American example, if you said you were born in New York in 1650, well, that wouldn't really quite be correct, because in 1650, New York was known as New Amsterdam. It was the Dutch colony. But if we speak about it today, we would obviously use the name New York because that's the name that we're familiar with. However, at the time that the events occurred, it had a different name. And that's essentially what we're dealing with here, that yes, they did build a city, they did build it on exactly that location, but at the time it was known under a different name. So given all that, we can cross Ramesses II off of our list as potential pharaohs of the Exodus. So let's go see who that might have actually been. Well, if we work backward before Solomon, Remember, the temple foundation was laid in the fourth year of Solomon's reign, 966 BC. And there's a scripture, 1 Kings 6:1, which says that the Exodus took place 480 years before that date. So simple math would say that the Exodus was in 1446 BC. Now, the question of who the Pharaoh is gets a little bit tougher, and depending on which chronology you look at. In the Orthodox chronology, that puts you in the reign of Amenhotep II, or somewhere about there, his father, Tutmos III, potentially, depending on which chronology you're using. And some of these dates slip around a little bit. But that's an idea of where the Exodus is in the old chronology. In the new chronology, it's during what's known as the very end of the 13th dynasty. Depending on how you look at it, the end of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom or the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, from a really unknown guy named Dudimos. And when that's a name similar to that is what the Egyptian historian Manetho gives as the name of the pharaoh when these things happen. So um, that's a really good candidate. Some other things that go on in this period of time. Well, we have the period of the judges, and the judges is really a mess in terms of trying to nail things down scripturally. The events of the judges all added up, and it's referenced in the New Testament, is 450 years. But that doesn't include the period from during the wilderness. It doesn't include the period where Joshua and the elders were still on the scene, and it doesn't include Samuel or Saul. So if you put all those in, you have about 600 years, actually, or David, 600 plus years that you have to squeeze into 480, and it just doesn't work. There also is only one internal reference that you can really latch onto in that period, and that's Jephthah, that he was 300 years after Israel came to the borders of Canaan. So he's the only one that we can really kind of nail down in the middle, and there's just lots of guesswork and different theories on all the other judges. I'm showing here my solution, which I've explained on the Biblical Timeline website. But there are clearly others, and this is a question that will probably never really get resolved unless we get some amazing archaeological discovery that nails down one or more of the other folks that you see here. Another point to make here is that in the line of Christ, which you see up there in purple, Nahshon, Solomon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, leading to David, there clearly are missing generations in here. We know that Solomon married Rahab, so we have to tie him to the period of the conquest. We know that Jesse's the father of David, so we have to tie him at the end. So that leaves a period of 400 years or so where we only have two names, Boaz and Obed. And so there is a practice, this is, we'll come back to this later, that you kind of name the significant ancestors along the way. So we don't know where to place Boaz and Obed other than during this period. And it raises the possibility that some of our dates, when we start getting back to the flood question, may be off. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Another just key point to make here, going back to the Egyptian side, I have flagged Akhenaten in both timelines and the Amarna letters. The key thing about those is the kings that are writing to Akhenaten from Canaan are complaining about a group called the Hebiru, which some have associated with the Hebrews that are kind of making their presence known and encroaching on Pharaoh's lands. Egypt is the major power in Canaan through this whole period. They're really the power behind the scenes, although at different degrees. If you go with the Orthodox chronology, this is a period of high power for Egypt up until the beginning of the 20th dynasty. If you go with the new chronology, it's actually a period, the beginnings are a period of really low power for Egypt. And it's only with Amenhotep I that they come back to a significant level of power. And that seems to fit a bit better with the biblical story. The other interesting thing about the Amarna letters, if you go with Roll's interpretation, is that in the new chronology, you have a guy named Libiah, who you can equate with Saul, and his son Mutbal, who equates with Ishbosheth, and potentially David is also mentioned in those letters. So really interesting kind of chronological aside, but again, the new chronology is far from settled and far from the majority opinion at this point. The other interesting point is that the kings of the 15th dynasty in Avaris, the same city that was built by the Hebrews earlier, according to the new chronology, are Greeks. And that makes for a very interesting story. The archaeological evidence does support that. So very interesting finds in the last 20 years or so. But that then leads on to the Greeks of the heroic age, all the way up to the conquest of Troy. So bottom line, though, we have a date now for the Exodus in 1446 BC, and we need that to work out when Jacob and Joseph would have been in Egypt. So we now have the question, how long was Israel in Egypt anyway? And there's two views here. So this is the first really significant dispute that we have in our chronology. And there are two options. The first is called the long sojourn. If you read your typical Christian Bible, it's based on what's called the Masoretic text. The oldest version of that text we have is about 1000 AD. And it says very simply that the sojourn of the children in Israel in Egypt was 430 years. This is backed up by the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have basically exactly the same language for that verse. So we would say, okay, it's 430 years from Jacob and the children of Israel arriving in Egypt until the Exodus. However, you have the alternate theory based on the Greek version of the Old Testament, what's known as the Septuagint, would tell you that now the time that they spent in Egypt and Canaan was 430 years. This was a view that was held in the New Testament by Paul. You'll see here a quote from Galatians. And it's also the view of Josephus, our key ancient historian, who would say that, it was actually 430 years from when Abraham came into Canaan and only 215 from when Jacob came into Egypt until the Exodus. So those are our two views. And let's see how that works out on our timeline. First of all, we need to understand the 215 years. You can actually do the math very simply from Scripture. Genesis 12:4 says that Abraham arrived in Canaan at the age of 75. Isaac's born when he's 100, so there's 25 years right there. Jacob's born when Isaac is 60. And then Jacob is 130 years old when he comes into Egypt. So you add all those up, you get 215 years. So that is kind of the basis essentially for splitting the 430 into two equal 215-year segments. We have right here how the years add up to get to that number and get the difference. So let's talk about the sojourn. This is a little bit complicated. In the middle, we have the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the years of plenty in the lean years. Jacob comes to Egypt in the third lean year. We also have Joseph. At the top, we have the Orthodox chronology and how that works, and at the bottom, we have the new chronology. So what's really interesting here is if you read the text of the Joseph story, in my mind, very clearly, it's taking place in a united and strong Egypt. Given the date that we're starting from, 1446, we have to go back into a period known as the Middle Kingdom and the 12th dynasty to get a strong united Egypt. So other solutions which would place Joseph in a period of the Hyksos or when Egypt was divided and weak just don't seem to really actually fit the story. So from my perspective, those are not options. We have to look for options that place Joseph in that late 12th dynasty, late Middle Kingdom. And interestingly enough, if we use a long sojourn following the Masoretic text in the Orthodox or Old chronology, we get exactly that. Joseph falls in the reign initially of Senusret II, and then his son Senusret III, and potentially into the regency of Amenemhet III, who's the son of Senusret III. So in those three kings in Egypt, now if we map those same three kings and go to the new chronology and use now a short sojourn of 215 years, we end up pretty much in the same place. With the arrival of Jacob in the old chronology is in the early reign of Senusret III. In the new chronology, it would be later in his reign, where he's already made his son Amenemhet III his co-regent. But we're pretty close to the same period of time here. So I find that very, very interesting. And basically the position I take here is if you want to stick with the old chronology, you have to go with a long sojourn to get you to the late 12th dynasty, late Middle Kingdom. If, however, you are going to use the New chronology, you really need to use that short sojourn to end up in the same spot. So we'll have different dates for the time that Joseph was and Jacob were in Egypt, but the same Egyptian kings, which is sort of the interesting twist on this. So where does that leave us? Well, I think at this point it's good to have a little bit of a recap. We started with the time of Christ, going back from 1 BC, we get to 586 as the fall of Jerusalem, 966 as the foundation of the temple. That answers our question number 6, when did the Hebrew kings live? We can jump back another 480 years based on 1 Kings 6:1 and understand that that was bracketing the period when the judges ruled, our question number 5. And that also gets us to the Exodus, our question number 4. So we have solid dates for all of those things. Now it gets a little bit more complicated. If we stick with the old chronology, then Jacob arrives in Egypt in 1876 BC, so 430 years before the Exodus. If we go with the new chronology, he arrives in 1661 BC, 215 years before the Exodus. And in either case, we can then add 215 years to get back to Abram's arrival in Canaan, and then another 75 to get back to his birth. And that gets us to 2166 BC, or in the old chronology, or 1951 BC in the new. So that's essentially where we are. We've answered questions 3 through 6 of our 7. We're not really going to address 7. It was actually on one of the charts I've shown you already. But we want to answer questions 1 and 2. So how do we get back to the flood and to creation? So now we have to work our way back to the flood. And to do that, we really only have the text. The text specifically to get to the flood is Genesis 11. And that gives the generations from the flood up through Terah and then on to Abraham. So that is our basis. The problem we have here is there are 2 different versions. The Masoretic, which is used in most Christian Bibles, and then the Greek Septuagint, which actually predates the earliest copies of the Masoretic by about 1,300 years. So there's reason to believe that they may actually be more accurate. Also, the Septuagint is what was quoted from, for the most part, in the New Testament. So clearly Jesus and the apostles gave it a lot of credibility. It was the text that they were used to. And also, though, potentially because they're writing in Greek, it was much more convenient to quote from the Greek Old Testament. But clearly from them, it has credibility. So the important differences here come in the generations. Basically, what age was each person when they gave birth or had the next person in line? And what you'll see is in the Masoretic, they're fairly young. They're in their 20s to mid-30s, whereas in the Septuagint, it's about 100 years later in most cases, except for Nahor, where it's a 50-year difference. And what that means is that from the flood to the birth of Abraham, there's a pretty big difference, about 658 years between the two, to cover that span of time. So that raises some interesting questions. So let's look at this a little differently. Let's look at it graphically. So if we graph this, and I've also put up here Genesis 5. So Genesis 5 covers the time from Adam to Noah, so everything before the flood, and Genesis 11 covers the period after the flood. Now, one thing you might ask is, well, what about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? You used that before. The problem is that we don't have any extant fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls for Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, except for one small fragment of one verse in Genesis 5, which does agree with the Masoretic text, but it's not enough to really lock all this down. It would be great if we had a complete copy, but we'll go with what we have, which is the Masoretic, which is complete, and obviously the Septuagint's also complete. You'll see in both cases, the Septuagint has more years from the birth of each person to the birth of their son, the next generation. There are a few exceptions. They agree on Jared. The Septuagint actually is slightly shorter on with Methuselah to Lamech, and there's a slight difference, but not big, between Lamech for Lamech going to Noah. Noah to his kids is consistent in both. Shem is consistent in both, but then again we have that gap through until we get to Terah, Abraham, and Isaac. So there's opportunity to add a lot of years in here. The other thing that I wanted to note, and that's the red circle, is you'll see that there's kind of a discontinuity in the Masoretic, that Clearly, there's a decline in ages as time goes by. People don't live as long. In the Masoretic, though, you get this weird uptick for Eber and then a significant drop for Peleg. Now, that could be kind of post-Tower of Babel, that Peleg is the key person at that point in time, or maybe something else. The Septuagint, however, much more consistent, sort of a linear decline. There's kind of a little bump around Syrig, but for a much more consistent decline in ages, much more what you would really expect if there is a decay in DNA or other things that's causing the lifespans to be shortened. So just want to draw that to your attention, but I am not going to make a decision between Masoretic and Septuagint. I'm going to leave that up to you, but I want to put those options out there. The other thing just to note is for those before the flood, the lifespans are pretty much the same in both texts. There's a little difference for Lamech, but again, the lifespans are different between from Arphaxad down to Nahor in Genesis 11. So that brings me to trying to answer questions 1 or 2. What about creation and what about the flood? And there are 4 options here based on what we've learned so far. If you follow Ussher now, you would end up with a short sojourn and a Masoretic text. That is the closest to him. Ussher is off about 45 years with Solomon. Altogether, it's a difference of 53 years. I'm not sure at this point where the other 8-year difference comes from, but the first 45 is from his solution to the Kings, which it was before a lot more modern scholarship, and I think it's good reason to believe that he was off on that one. But the interesting thing is that Ussher's dates are the latest dates for creation and the flood of the 4 options that were given here. So pretty much any other solution will get you to something earlier than 4004 BC or 391 BC for creation in my example. If you follow the Septuagint on the short sojourn and the lifespans of the patriarchs from Adam to Terah, you get back as far as almost 5200 BC for creation, and you flood at roughly 3000 BC. If you use the longer sojourn and the Septuagint, following the old chronology, you get back as far as 5400 BC for creation. And actually, in the Septuagint, there is an extra generation that I did not include because it's not attested anywhere else. There's an extra Canaan that would add even another 130 years. So you could go all the way back, move all these dates on the Septuagint side back another 130 years. So you get to some fairly old dates. Now, I think most secular scholars would still put the beginning of civilization and reasonably maybe the flood at 10,000 BC. That there may be generations that are missing. I tend to doubt it in Genesis 5 and 11 because it gives the ages, but it's possible. So it could be earlier, but these are the dates that you get from Scripture under these 2 different approaches and interpretations. And really, any of these dates could be correct. There's pluses and minuses to all of them, but I tend to go with the Septuagint version because based on what we know of Egyptian and Assyrian history, Ussher's dates I think are just too late. We need to look at something that's a bit earlier, and I'll show you why. Just to kind of leave you, in the new chronology, here is the whole period from Moses back to the flood. The period before the flood is kind of not interesting. It's the same list of names. It's just a question of how long you stretch out that timeline. But we get some interesting things here. And this is the complete timeline, not just for the patriarchs, but also for Egypt, based on what we know, and also for the civilizations of Mesopotamia, based on the Sumerian kings list. And what I've done here is highlight in red some of the names that you might be familiar with or most familiar with in this. On the lower right, we've got Hammurabi. So he's actually a contemporary or just before Moses. And he's really the one that makes Babylon great. Prior to that, there are a number of other kingdoms that become Babylon or that predated it, Ur of the Chaldees being one. And we see that Terah probably left Ur of the Chaldees in a period where it had lost its importance, that going to Akkad, which was the predecessor of the Assyrian kingdoms, and Sargon I being the first great king of Akkad. Going back further, we are in the kingdom of Uruk, as it's called, in the first 3 dynasties of that. And that is what takes us back potentially to the flood. We have Gilgamesh appearing in there. We have Cush and Nimrod have been identified by role as the first two kings of that dynasty. Now he stretches it out before the flood because he adds the extra 130 years for Canaan, but you could kind of compress this a little bit to get to a birth of Cush just after the flood, and that would all work. Also in Egypt, for those of you who are fans of the Mummy and Scorpion King franchises, I've kind of put up Imhotep there and Scorpion. For those who might wonder, Imhotep is clearly not Joseph. He's just way, way too early. And there is solid evidence of Joseph archaeologically that you can find in that 12th dynasty. So lastly, I've put the Great Pyramid and the Tower of Babel. So interestingly, the Great Pyramid was built after the Tower of Babel. So there may be a link there, and I think some would say there's a really good chance that there is. But that's it. So that gets us back to the beginning, and that's the overall overview of the chronology. I hope that you've enjoyed that. We are at an end. If you want to know more about this, there is more on the Biblical Timeline website. There's an article on Joseph. There's an article on the Judges, and there is another video on the period of the Kings, and there will be more as I have time to put it together. So thanks again for everything, and I hope you enjoyed the video.